I should have known something was wrong when my daughter Jessica asked me to walk her down the aisle 3 times in one conversation. Not because she was nervous about her wedding day, but because she kept forgetting she'd already asked. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere darker than I could have imagined. The letter from my father's estate attorney had arrived exactly 6 months before Jessica's wedding. $9 million. That's what the old man had left me after 43 years of calling me a disappointment, a failure, and worse. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd died the same week Jessica announced her engagement to Derek Morrison, a man I'd never liked but couldn't quite put my finger on why. If you've ever held a secret that could change everything, you know the weight I'm talking about. It sits in your chest like a stone, making every conversation feel like you're lying, even when you're telling the truth. But I had my reasons for keeping quiet. Good reasons, I thought. Before you judge an old man's choices, hit that subscribe button. Because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about family, trust, and the price of keeping secrets. And if you've got family drama brewing in your own life, you're going to want to hear how this all played out. The wedding planning consumed the next 6 months. Jessica threw herself into it with the kind of manic energy that should have been my first real warning sign. Designer dress, ice sculptures, a venue that costs more than most people's houses. Derek supported every expensive decision with enthusiasm that struck me as performative, like he was auditioning for the role of devoted fiancé. I watched from the sidelines, my bank account growing heavier with each passing day as investments matured and dividends rolled in. $9 million changes how you see the world, even when you're trying not to let it. Suddenly, Jessica's $28,000 wedding dress seemed less outrageous and more manageable. But I kept my mouth shut. My late wife Sarah would have handled this differently. She would have seen right through Derek's charm offensive, would have asked the right questions, pushed the right buttons. But Sarah had been gone for 3 years by then, and I was still learning how to navigate this father-daughter relationship without her wisdom to guide me. Sarah always said I was too trusting, too willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was right. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Morrison family estate. Derek's father, Charles Morrison, was old money, the kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself but whispers in perfectly tailored suits and understated luxury. I remember standing in his marble foyer, looking up at oil paintings of dead Morrisons, and feeling like I was being sized up. Charles Morrison had that particular gift of making you feel simultaneously welcomed and judged, like you'd passed some test you didn't know you were taking. "Henry," he said to me that night, gripping my hand with the firmness of a man who'd spent his life making deals. "Jessica tells me you're in construction." "Semi-retired," I replied, which wasn't exactly a lie. The inheritance meant I could afford to be selective about projects, though I hadn't told anyone about the sudden change in my financial circumstances. "Smart man. Know when to step back and let the next generation take over." He glanced meaningfully at Derek, who was across the room charming Jessica's college friends with stories that seemed to grow more elaborate with each telling. "Derek's got big plans. Real estate development, investment opportunities. Kid's got vision." Something about the way Charles Morrison said vision made my skin crawl. It was the tone of a man who'd spent his life convincing other people to part with their money. But I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the proud future father-in-law. Jessica looked radiant that night. She'd always been beautiful, got Sarah's delicate features and my stubborn jaw, but there was something different about her. A brittleness around the edges that I told myself was pre-wedding stress. She barely ate, kept checking her phone, and jumped every time someone touched her shoulder unexpectedly. "Dad," she pulled me aside after the toasts. "Can we talk?" We stepped out onto the Morrisons' back terrace, overlooking their perfectly manicured gardens. The night air was cool, and I could smell jasmine blooming somewhere in the darkness. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." My heart started pounding. Had she somehow found out about the inheritance? Had Derek been digging into our family's finances? "Of course, sweetheart." "What is it?" She was quiet for so long that I started to wonder if she changed her mind about asking. Then, in a voice so small I almost didn't hear her, "Do you think I'm making a mistake?" The question hung between us like a loaded gun. I had about 3 seconds to decide how to answer, and in those 3 seconds, I thought about a lot of things. I thought about Sarah, who would have grabbed Jessica by the shoulders and demanded to know what was really going on. I thought about the $9 million sitting in my accounts, money that could give Jessica freedom to make any choice she wanted. I thought about Derek's perfect smile and his father's calculating eyes. But what I said was, "Do you think you're making a mistake?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's such a dad answer." Turn the question back on me. "I'm serious, Jess. This is your life. If something doesn't feel right, everything feels right," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Derek's wonderful. His family's wonderful. I'm just being silly. Pre-wedding jitters, right?" I should have pressed her. Should have asked the follow-up questions that might have changed everything. But I was thinking about the inheritance, about whether Derek knew something he shouldn't know, about whether my daughter was marrying him for reasons that had nothing to do with love. "Right," I said. "Just jitters." She hugged me then, and I felt how thin she'd gotten. When had she lost so much weight? When had her hugs started feeling desperate instead of affectionate? The wedding day dawned perfect. Not a cloud in the sky, temperature in the mid-70s, a light breeze that made the flower arrangements dance just enough to look magical in photographs. Jessica looked like a princess in her $28,000 dress, though I noticed she needed it taken in at the last minute. Derek looked like a movie star in his custom tuxedo, all charm and white teeth and perfectly styled hair. I walked my daughter down the aisle to Canon in D, just like she dreamed about since she was 7 years old. Her hand was trembling on my arm, and I kept whispering reassurances that felt hollow in my mouth. When we reached the altar and the officiant asked who was giving this woman to be married, I said, "Her mother and I do," like we'd practiced, even though Sarah wasn't there to do anything. But here's the thing about weddings, they're performances as much as they are ceremonies. Everyone has a role to play, lines to deliver, emotions to display on cue. And as I took my seat in the front row and watched my daughter promise to love, honor, and cherish Derek Morrison for the rest of her life, I realized that everyone was acting. Including me. The reception was everything Jessica had dreamed it would be. The band was perfect, the food was exquisite, the cake was a work of art. I gave a speech about how proud Sarah and I were of Jessica, how much we loved her, how welcome Derek was in our family. All of it true, but not complete. Because what I didn't say was that I had enough money to give them any wedding present they could imagine. What I didn't say was that Derek's constant questions about my retirement plans and my investment portfolio had been setting off alarm bells for months. What I didn't say was that I'd hired a private investigator. Wait. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because that decision, hiring the PI, that's where this whole story really begins. And it's the decision that saved my daughter's life, even though it nearly destroyed our relationship in the process. 3 weeks after the wedding, Derek Morrison asked me to lunch. Not unusual, you might think. New son-in-law, building relationships, all very normal. Except Derek had never asked me to lunch before. In the 18 months he'd been dating Jessica, our interactions had been limited to family gatherings where conversation was safely diluted by other people and social expectations. We met at Morton's downtown, Derek's choice. He ordered the most expensive steak on the menu and a bottle of wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. Back when I had to worry about grocery budgets. "Henry," he said, cutting into his $45 ribeye, "I wanted to talk to you about opportunities." That word again. The same way his father had said it at the rehearsal dinner, loaded with implications I couldn't quite decode. "What kind of opportunities?" "Investment opportunities. Real estate development. Jessica mentioned that you've done well for yourself in construction over the years." He paused to take a sip of wine, watching me over the rim of his glass. "She also mentioned that you've been talking about fully retiring soon." I hadn't been talking about fully retiring. In fact, I'd been more active in my business in recent months, though I'd been selective about which projects to take on. The inheritance gave me the luxury of choice, but I'd never discussed retirement with Jessica. So where had Derek gotten that idea? Did she now? She's worried about you, actually. Says you seem different since your father passed away. More withdrawn. She thinks maybe you're dealing with some unresolved issues around his death. The manipulation was so smooth I almost missed it. Derek was fishing for information about my father's estate, while positioning himself as the concerned son-in-law looking out for his wife's emotional well-being. It was masterful, really. If I hadn't been expecting something like this, I might have fallen for it completely. My father and I had a complicated relationship, I said carefully. His death wasn't unexpected. Of course not. But sometimes these things come with complications. Estate issues, family obligations, financial pressures you might not have anticipated. There it was. The real question buried in therapeutic concern and family solidarity. Derek Morrison wanted to know about my inheritance. The question was, how did he know there was an inheritance to ask about? That afternoon, I drove to a nondescript office building in the business district and met with Frank Castellano, a private investigator I'd found through a client who'd used him during a messy divorce. Frank was exactly what Central Casting would order for a PI: rumpled suit, 5 o'clock shadow at 2 in the afternoon, eyes that looked like they'd seen everything twice. I want you to look into my son-in-law, I told him. Cheating? I don't know. Maybe something financial. Frank leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously. Financial investigations take longer. More expensive. And they tend to turn up things people wish they'd never learned. How much more expensive? Depends what we find. Could be a few thousand. Could be 20, 30,000 if we have to dig deep. Before the inheritance, $30,000 would have been a crushing expense. Now it was a rounding error. Do it. What's your timeline? I thought about Jessica's weight loss, her nervous energy, the way she'd asked if she was making a mistake. As fast as you can manage without cutting corners. Frank Castellano was worth every penny I paid him. The preliminary report came back in 2 weeks. Derek Morrison, age 31, MBA from Wharton, employed by Morrison Development Group, his father's company, as a senior vice president. Clean credit report, no criminal record, no obvious red flags. A golden boy, just like he appeared to be. But Frank had found inconsistencies in Derek's employment history. 6-month gaps between jobs that didn't align with his resume. References who were harder to reach than they should have been. A pattern of short-term employment that suggested either exceptional ambition or chronic job hopping for reasons that weren't immediately clear. This could be nothing, Frank told me over coffee at a diner near his office. Guy's young, wealthy family, probably got bored easy. But there's something hinky about the timeline at his last job before joining Daddy's company. Hinky how? He was a financial advisor at Goldman Sachs in Chicago. Left in 2019, supposedly to pursue other opportunities. But I talked to some people who were there. Word is he didn't leave voluntarily. The coffee in my cup had gone cold, but I didn't notice. Fired? That's what I need to find out. If he was terminated for cause, there might be records. NDAs, settlement agreements, complaints filed with regulatory bodies. This is where it gets expensive. Do it. 3 more weeks of investigation revealed a story that made my blood run cold. Derek Morrison hadn't left Goldman Sachs to pursue other opportunities. He'd been terminated for financial misconduct. Specifically, he'd been using his access to client accounts to fund personal investments. When the investments went bad, he'd covered the losses by moving money between accounts, creating a shell game that had taken 6 months for compliance to uncover. No criminal charges were filed. The Morrison family had made the clients whole, paid additional damages, and negotiated confidentiality agreements that effectively buried the story. Derek had walked away with his MBA and his reputation intact, at least on paper. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Frank had found evidence that Derek had been researching Jessica long before they met. Social media surveillance, background checks, even financial records requests that suggested he'd known about my construction business and its profitability from the very beginning. "Your son-in-law didn't meet your daughter by accident," Frank told me, sliding a thick manila folder across the table. "This was a long-term strategy." I stared at the folder like it was a snake. "Strategy for what?" "Access. Your daughter works at that nonprofit, makes decent money but nothing spectacular. You, on the other hand, own a successful construction company with assets in the millions. At least, that's what the public records show." My mouth went dry. "What public records?" "Business licenses, property ownership, equipment loans. Someone with the right connections could piece together a pretty good estimate of your net worth. And Derek Morrison has the right connections." I opened the folder with hands that had started to shake. Inside were printouts of online searches, credit reports, property records, and what looked like a dossier on Jessica's personal life going back 3 years. Photos from her social media accounts, information about her job, her friends, her habits. Even her jogging route through the park near her apartment. How long was he watching her before they met? At least 6 months. Maybe longer. The room started to spin. I thought about Derek's charming introduction at Jessica's birthday party, how natural their conversation had seemed, how perfectly he'd matched her interests and opinions. It had all been scripted. Rehearsed. A performance designed to make my daughter fall in love with a lie. But why? What was Derek's endgame? I was worth a few million on paper, but that was hardly enough to justify this level of elaborate deception. Unless… "Frank," I said slowly, "what if Derek knows about something else? Something that's not in the public records?" "Like what?" I couldn't tell him about the inheritance. Not yet. But I needed to know how deep Derek's research had gone, how much he might know about my father's estate, about the $9 million that had landed in my account 6 months before Derek had proposed to Jessica. "I need you to find out if Derek or his family has been asking questions about my father's death. About his estate. About anything that might have come to me after he passed away." Frank studied my face for a long moment. "Henry, is there something you're not telling me?" "There might be. But I need to know what Derek knows before I decide how much to share. This is going to get messier before it gets cleaner." "I know. And more expensive." "I don't care about the money." Frank raised an eyebrow at that, and I realized I'd said too much. When you're pretending to be a semi-retired construction worker, you don't casually dismiss expenses that could run into 6 figures. "Okay," Frank said. "But Henry? If this gets as bad as I think it might, you're going to have to tell your daughter eventually. And the longer you wait, the harder that conversation is going to be." I drove home that afternoon with Frank's folder on the passenger seat, feeling like I was carrying dynamite. Everything I thought I knew about my daughter's marriage was wrong. Everything I thought I knew about Derek Morrison was a carefully constructed fiction. And somehow, all of it was connected to money that Derek shouldn't even know existed. The real question was, what was Derek planning to do once he figured out how to get his hands on it? I was about to find out. Jessica called me crying at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after her wedding. "Dad, can you come over? Please?" I was dressed and in my car within 5 minutes. Jessica and Derek lived in a high-rise downtown, the kind of place with a doorman and marble lobbies and rent that should have been impossible on their combined salaries. I'd wondered how they could afford it, but Derek had explained something about family connections and special rates that I hadn't questioned at the time. I should have questioned everything. Jessica answered the door in a bathrobe, her eyes red and swollen. Behind her, their apartment was a disaster zone. Furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor, what looked like the contents of Derek's home office dumped in the living room. "Where's Derek?" I asked. "Gone. He left about an hour ago." "What happened here?" She collapsed onto the couch, which was the only piece of furniture still in its proper place. "We had a fight. A bad one." About money? My stomach dropped. What about money? He's been asking me questions about you. About your business, about what kind of money you make, about whether you inherited anything when Grandpa died. She looked up at me with eyes that reminded me painfully of Sarah. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Here it was. The moment I'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. Frank Castellano's investigation had revealed the scope of Derek's deception, but I still didn't know exactly what he was after or how close he was to getting it. Ask me anything. Did you inherit money from Grandpa? I sat down next to her, my mind racing. The truth was complicated. The truth was $9 million complicated. The truth was that Derek had somehow found out about an inheritance that I'd kept secret from everyone, including my own daughter. Yes, I said. How much? Enough to change things. Jessica stared at me like I'd slapped her. Change things how? Dad, what are you talking about? So I told her. Not everything, but enough. I told her about the letter from the attorney, about the inheritance that had shocked me as much as anyone. I told her about keeping it secret because I wasn't sure what to do with that kind of money, wasn't sure how it would change our relationship, wasn't sure I wanted my father's wealth after a lifetime of his disapproval. What I didn't tell her was about the investigation. What I didn't tell her was that Derek had been watching her, planning this, manipulating both of us from the very beginning. $9 million? Her voice cracked. Dad, you had $9 million when I was planning my wedding, and you let me stress about the cost of flowers? I offered to help pay for. That's not the point. She stood up, pacing across the scattered papers. The point is that you didn't trust me. You didn't trust me with the truth about our family's situation. Jessica, I was trying to protect you. From what? From having options? From being able to make informed decisions about my life? She was right, and we both knew it. But there was more to the story, and I was running out of ways to avoid telling her the worst part. There's something else, I said. What else could there possibly be? Derek knows about the money. Jessica stopped pacing. What do you mean he knows? I mean he's been researching our family's finances for months. Maybe longer. I think that's why he married you. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Jessica's face went through about 5 different expressions in 10 seconds: confusion, disbelief, anger, hurt, and finally something that looked like recognition. That's impossible, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Think about it, Jess. How did you two meet? At my birthday party. Sarah from work introduced us. Had Sarah ever mentioned Derek before that night? Had you ever heard his name? She was quiet for a long moment. No, but... What did he say when he introduced himself? He said he'd heard a lot about me. From Sarah? Another pause. I assumed from Sarah. But now that you mention it, Sarah seemed as surprised as I was that they knew each other. I pulled out my phone and showed her some of the documents Frank had uncovered. Social media searches, background checks, financial inquiries. Her face grew paler with each page. This is from before you met him, I said gently. Months before. Jessica sank back onto the couch, the fight going out of her. So he's been lying to me from the beginning. It looks that way. About everything? I don't know. Maybe not everything. But about enough. She was crying again, but quietly now. The kind of tears that come when shock starts to wear off and reality sets in. I wanted to hold her, to tell her it would be okay, to promise that I would fix this somehow. But I wasn't sure I could. What does he want? She asked. Money, I assume. Access to the inheritance somehow. How? It's not like I can just write him a check for $9 million. No, but you could influence me to make certain investments. Business partnerships. Loans that don't get repaid. There are a lot of ways to separate a wealthy man from his money, especially if you have access to his family. Jessica looked around at the destroyed apartment. Is that what the fight was about? He wanted me to ask you for money? What did he say exactly? He said he had an investment opportunity. Real estate development project that needed private funding. He wanted me to talk to you about it, to see if you might be interested in partnering with Morrison Development Group. And there it was. Derek's endgame, laid out as simply as a business proposition. Use Jessica to get me to invest in a Morrison family project, then find ways to make sure that investment never pays dividends. Legal theft, executed through family manipulation and hidden behind the veneer of legitimate business dealings. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know anything about your financial situation. I told him you were semi-retired and probably didn't have that kind of money lying around. She laughed bitterly. I guess that made him angry. Angry enough to tear apart the apartment? Angry enough to tell me what he really thought about me. About us. About this whole marriage. I didn't want to ask, but I had to know. What did he say? He said I was naive if I thought he'd married me for love. He said he'd done his research, knew exactly what he was getting into, and that I should be grateful someone like him was willing to settle for someone like me. The rage that hit me was white-hot and immediate. I'd been in construction for 35 years, worked with men who could start a fight over the color of safety cones. But I'd never felt the kind of anger that makes you understand how people end up in prison for assault. He said, "What? Dad, it's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but..." "No, Jessica. It's not okay. None of this is okay." I stood up and started pacing myself, trying to walk off the urge to drive to wherever Derek Morrison was hiding and show him exactly what this semi-retired construction worker was capable of when someone hurt his daughter. Where is he now? I don't know. He threw some clothes in a bag and left. Said he needed to think about whether this marriage was worth the hassle. Whether it was worth the hassle? His words, not mine. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Derek had spent months, maybe years, planning this elaborate deception. He'd researched Jessica's life, manipulated their meeting, performed the role of devoted boyfriend and loving husband. And now that his plan had hit a snag, she was a hassle to be evaluated and potentially discarded. But Derek Morrison had made a critical error in judgment. He'd assumed I was just another mark, another wealthy target to be manipulated through family connections. He'd assumed I would be easy prey because I was older, because I came from humble beginnings, because I'd kept my inheritance secret. He'd assumed I wouldn't fight back. "Jessica," I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. This isn't over. Derek isn't going to just walk away from $9 million because you had one fight." "What do you mean?" "I mean he's going to try something else. A different approach. Maybe he'll come back apologetic and charming, with a story about how stressed he's been and how much he loves you. Maybe he'll try to go around you entirely, approach me directly with business propositions and investment opportunities. So what do we do?" I looked at my daughter, sitting in the wreckage of her marriage and her trust, and made a decision that would change everything. "We make him think he's winning," I said. "And then we destroy him." The next morning, Derek Morrison came home with flowers and apologies. Jessica called to warn me, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "He's here, Dad. Acting like nothing happened. Like he didn't destroy our apartment and tell me our marriage was a business transaction." "What's he saying?" "That he was stressed about work, that his father's been pressuring him about business performance, that he took it out on me unfairly. He's being charming." Of course he was. Derek Morrison was nothing if not adaptable. When the direct approach failed, he'd fall back on manipulation techniques that had probably been working for him since childhood. "Don't confront him with what we know," I said. "Not yet. Dad, I can't just pretend. I know it's hard. But if we tip our hand too early, he'll disappear. Maybe surface somewhere else with a new identity and a new plan. We need him to stay put long enough for us to document everything." Frank Castellano had been busy in the 12 hours since Jessica's call. Derek's hasty departure from their apartment had been tracked to a hotel downtown, where he'd spent the night making phone calls to numbers that Frank was still identifying. But the preliminary traces were promising, or disturbing, depending on your perspective. Your son-in-law has been talking to some interesting people, Frank told me over lunch. Lawyers, financial advisors, and what looks like a private investigator of his own. He's investigating me? That would be my guess. Trying to confirm the size of the inheritance, maybe looking for leverage to use against you. The irony was almost funny. Derek was hiring professionals to uncover information about wealth that I'd already decided to use against him. But his investigation was focused on the money itself, while mine was focused on his character. And character, as my father used to say, is what matters when the stakes get high. There's something else, Frank said. Derek's not working alone. What do you mean? The Morrison family has resources we're just starting to understand. Charles Morrison didn't build his wealth in real estate development. He built it in financial services. Specifically, he built it by identifying wealthy targets and finding ways to separate them from their assets through supposedly legitimate business ventures. My sandwich suddenly tasted like cardboard. You're saying this is a family business? I'm saying the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And I'm saying Derek Morrison has been very well trained. We were dealing with professionals. The realization changed everything about our situation. This wasn't a simple case of a gold digger marrying for money. This was organized, systematic financial predation, with Jessica as the unwitting access point and me as the primary target. How many targets are we talking about? Still working on that. But Frank found records of at least 6 other similar situations over the past 15 years. Wealthy older men, recently widowed or divorced, with adult children who could be used as leverage points. What happened to them? Frank's expression told me I probably didn't want to know. Financially? They were cleaned out. Personally? 3 of them died under circumstances that were questionable. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop 20 degrees. Are you telling me that Derek Morrison and his family are killers? I'm telling you they're dangerous. And I'm telling you that $9 million is worth killing for, especially if you've done it before. I drove home that afternoon with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. What had started as concerns about my daughter's marriage had evolved into something much darker. We weren't just dealing with financial fraud. We were potentially dealing with people who had killed to protect their schemes. But backing down wasn't an option. Jessica was already in danger, had been in danger from the moment Derek Morrison had identified her as his route to my inheritance. Running would only delay the inevitable confrontation while giving Derek and his family more time to plan. So we would have to be smarter than they were. Faster. And we would have to be absolutely ruthless in our execution. The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. Derek wanted access to my inheritance through investment opportunities with Morrison Development Group. So we would give him exactly what he wanted, but on our terms and with our safeguards. I called Derek personally that afternoon. Henry! His voice was warm, friendly, with just the right note of surprise. Good to hear from you. How are things? Things are complicated, Derek. I understand you and Jessica had some difficulties last night. Just a misunderstanding. You know how it is, newlywed stress, work pressure. We worked it out. I'm glad to hear that. Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. Jessica mentioned that you'd brought up some kind of business opportunity. The pause on the other end of the line was so brief I almost missed it. But it was there, the moment when Derek Morrison realized that his wife's supposed ignorance about my financial situation had been a front. Did she now? She did. And I have to admit, I'm intrigued. I've been looking for ways to diversify my investments, especially since my father's estate was settled. Another pause, longer this time. Derek was recalibrating, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much Jessica had told me. I'd be happy to discuss it with you, he said finally. Though I should mention that we're talking about a fairly substantial initial investment. 7 figures minimum. That shouldn't be a problem. The words hung in the air like bait. I could practically hear Derek's heartbeat accelerating over the phone. Really? Well, in that case, maybe we should meet. Talk through the details properly. I'd like that. But Derek? Yes? I want to be very clear about something. Jessica is the most important thing in the world to me. If anything were to happen to her, if anyone were to hurt her in any way, I would respond with a level of violence that would surprise everyone involved. The threat was delivered in the same tone I might use to discuss the weather, but Derek Morrison was smart enough to hear the steel underneath. Of course, Henry. Jessica's safety and happiness are my top priorities too. I'm glad we understand each other. We scheduled the meeting for the following week at Morrison Development Group's offices downtown. That gave Frank Castellano time to finish his background research on the Morrison family's previous victims, and gave me time to prepare for what might be the performance of my life. Because Derek Morrison wasn't the only one who could lie convincingly when the stakes were high enough. That evening, I sat in my study, the same room where I'd opened my father's attorney's letter 6 months earlier, and planned out the destruction of my son-in-law with the same methodical precision I'd once used to plan construction projects. The difference was that construction builds things up. What I was planning would tear Derek Morrison's world down to its foundations. But first, I had a phone call to make. Frank Castellano had given me the contact information for 2 of the Morrison family's previous victims who were still alive. Men who'd lost everything to elaborate investment schemes orchestrated by Charles Morrison and executed by his son. Men who'd been waiting years for someone to give them a chance at revenge. Mr. Patterson, I said when the first call connected. My name is Henry Walsh. I believe we have a mutual enemy. The conversation that followed confirmed everything Frank had uncovered and more. Thomas Patterson had lost $4.2 million to a Morrison Development Group project that had existed only on paper. His daughter had been married to Derek's older brother, Michael, until the money disappeared and Michael Morrison vanished along with it. They killed my daughter, Patterson told me, his voice hollow with grief and rage. Car accident, they said. Brake failure on a mountain road. But Lisa was a mechanic. She knew cars better than most men. Her brakes didn't just fail. The second victim, Robert Chin, had a similar story. $8 million invested in a casino development project that had never been built. His son had married Derek's cousin, a woman who disappeared after the money was gone, leaving behind a suicide note that Chin insisted was forged. They're not just thieves, Chin told me. They're predators. And they've been doing this for decades. By the time I hung up from the second call, I understood exactly what kind of enemy I was facing. The Morrison family wasn't just sophisticated in their financial crimes. They were willing to commit murder to protect their schemes. Which meant that Jessica was in more danger than I'd ever imagined. But it also meant that I had allies. Men who'd lost everything to the Morrison family and who would do anything to see justice served. Men who understood that sometimes the law isn't enough, that sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands. The war was about to begin. And Derek Morrison had no idea what was coming for him. The Morrison Development Group offices occupied 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that screams success and prosperity to anyone willing to be impressed by marble lobbies and expensive art. I wasn't impressed. I'd built buildings like this, knew how much they cost and how little they actually meant about the character of the people inside them. Derek met me in the lobby, looking every inch the successful young executive, in his $1,000 suit and perfectly styled hair. He was accompanied by his father, Charles Morrison, and another man he introduced as their head of investments, Marcus Webb. If you've ever walked into a room knowing you're outnumbered but holding all the real power, you understand the electric tension that filled that elevator as we rode up to the 32nd floor. They thought they were bringing me into their world, their territory, their carefully controlled environment. They had no idea that I'd spent the past week learning everything there was to know about their operation. Henry, Charles Morrison said as we settled into his corner office. Derek tells me you're interested in diversifying your portfolio. That's right. My father left me in a position where I need to make some decisions about long-term investments. And what kind of timeline are we discussing? Immediate. I'm not getting any younger, and I'd like to see my money working for me while I can still enjoy the returns. The 3 men exchanged glances that they probably thought were subtle. In reality, they might as well have been holding up signs that said, "Sucker in the building." Derek pulled out a leather portfolio and spread several glossy brochures across the conference table. "We have several projects in development that might interest you. Mixed-use residential and commercial developments, all in high-growth markets." I studied the materials with the expression of a man who was impressed but trying not to show it. The projects looked legitimate on the surface: architectural renderings, market analysis, projected returns that were aggressive but not impossible. It was professional work, the kind of presentation that would convince most potential investors. But Frank Castellano's research had revealed that every Morrison Development Group project for the past 5 years had followed the same pattern. Impressive initial presentations, substantial upfront investments from private partners, construction delays and cost overruns that ate through the capital, and final project cancellations that left investors with nothing but worthless contracts and legal bills. "These look very promising," I said. "What kind of initial investment are we talking about?" "The Riverside Commons project has partnership opportunities starting at $2.5 million, Marcus Webb said. "But for the kind of returns we're projecting, I'd recommend a more substantial commitment." "How substantial?" $5 to $7 million would position you as a major partner with significant influence over project decisions." $7 million. Nearly 80% of my inheritance, committed to a project that would never be completed. It was a bigger bite than they'd taken from most of their previous victims, but then again, most of their previous victims hadn't been worth $9 million. "That's a significant commitment," I said. "Significant investments require significant returns," Charles Morrison replied smoothly. "We're not in the business of small gains, Henry. We're talking about the kind of wealth building that sets up your family for generations." The mention of family was Derek's cue to lean forward with his most sincere expression. "Jessica and I have been talking about starting a family soon. This kind of investment opportunity could fund their education, set them up for success, create the kind of legacy that your father would have been proud of." The casual manipulation was breathtaking. They were using my daughter's future children who didn't even exist yet, as emotional leverage to convince me to hand over $7 million to a criminal enterprise. But I played my part, nodding thoughtfully and asking the kinds of questions that a wealthy but unsophisticated investor might ask. Timeline questions, return projections, exit strategies. All of it designed to make them believe I was exactly the kind of mark they'd built their careers on exploiting. "I'm very interested," I said finally. "But I'll need to have my attorney review the partnership agreements before I commit to anything." "Of course," Charles Morrison said. "Though I should mention that we're hoping to close this round of investment within the next 2 weeks. After that, the partnership slots will be filled." The artificial deadline was another classic manipulation technique. Create urgency to prevent the mark from thinking too carefully about the decision. But what they didn't know was that I'd already made my decision before walking into their office. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. $7 million, deposited into their accounts, committed to their fraudulent project. But not in the way they expected. 2 weeks should be plenty of time, I said. "I'll have my people put together the necessary documentation." We shook hands all around, and I left the Morrison Development Group offices with a briefcase full of investment materials and the satisfied expressions of 3 men who thought they'd just hooked the biggest fish of their careers. They had no idea that I was the one setting the hook. That afternoon, I met with my actual attorney, Patricia Hendricks, a woman I'd worked with for 15 years and trusted with every significant decision in my business life. Patricia was the kind of lawyer who wore sensible shoes and carried a briefcase older than Derek Morrison, but who could dissect a contract like a surgeon performing heart surgery. "Henry," she said after reviewing the Morrison Development Group materials, "this is garbage." "I know. The partnership agreement is full of loopholes that essentially give the Morrison family unlimited access to investor funds with minimal accountability. The project timeline is unrealistic, the market analysis is based on outdated data, and the exit clauses are structured to make it nearly impossible for investors to recover their capital if the project fails." "I know. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses. Then why are we having this conversation? Because I want you to help me structure a deal that looks like I'm giving them $7 million, but actually gives me complete control over their entire operation. She was quiet for a long moment. Henry, what aren't you telling me? So I told her. Not everything. I still wasn't ready to explain about the private investigator or the evidence of murder, but enough to make her understand that Derek Morrison and his family were criminals who'd been using Jessica to get to my money. They're planning to steal $7 million from you, she said. They're planning to try. But what they're actually going to do is hand me the legal ammunition to destroy them completely. How? By accepting investment funds that I'm going to structure as a loan secured by all Morrison Development Group assets. When the project fails, and we both know it's going to fail, I'll have the legal right to seize everything they own to recover my investment. Patricia's expression shifted from concern to something that looked like predatory interest. She'd built her career on protecting her clients from exactly the kind of fraud the Morrison family specialized in. The opportunity to turn the tables on professional con artists was apparently appealing. That's ambitious, she said. And potentially very satisfying. But Henry, if these people are as dangerous as you believe, won't they try to stop you? They can try. I'm serious. If they've killed people before, then they've already decided that Jessica and I are expendable once they get the money. Our only choice is to get them before they get us. Patricia studied the Morrison investment materials again, this time with the focused attention of a lawyer who'd decided to go to war. How long do I have to put this together? They want a commitment within 2 weeks. I want to give them an answer in 1 week that looks like exactly what they're hoping for but is actually a legal trap they'll never see coming. 1 week. She made notes in her precise handwriting. Henry, this is going to be expensive. Complex financial structures, multiple legal entities, international banking components to make everything ironclad. Before the inheritance, expensive would have been a conversation stopper. Now it was just another tool in the arsenal. Cost is not a concern. Getting my daughter out of this situation alive is the only concern. That evening, I called Frank Castellano with an update on the day's events and a new assignment. I need you to find out everything you can about Morrison Development Group's current financial situation, I told him. Asset valuations, outstanding debts, cash flow problems, anything that might make them desperate enough to take bigger risks than usual. You think they're in trouble? I think they're pushing harder than they have with previous victims. $7 million up front, artificial deadline pressure, bringing in multiple family members for the initial pitch. That suggests either greed or desperation, and I need to know which one. What's the difference? Greedy criminals can be reasoned with sometimes. Desperate criminals are willing to do anything. Frank's research over the next few days painted a picture that was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because the Morrison family was indeed in financial trouble. Several of their legitimate real estate projects had gone bad in the recent market downturn, leaving them with massive debts and cash flow problems. Terrifying because desperate criminals with a history of violence were exactly as dangerous as I'd feared. But the financial pressure also created an opportunity. The Morrison family needed my $7 million not just for profit, but for survival. Which meant they would be willing to accept terms that they might normally reject, as long as the money was real and available quickly. It was time to spring the trap. I called Derek on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after our initial meeting. Derek, it's Henry. I've had my attorney review the investment materials, and I'm ready to move forward. That's fantastic news, Henry. I'll set up another meeting with. Actually, I'd like to expedite this. My attorney has prepared the investment documents, and I'm ready to transfer the funds as soon as we sign the agreements. The pause on Derek's end told me everything I needed to know. He'd expected more delay, more negotiation, more opportunity to manipulate the terms in his favor. The speed of my decision had caught him off guard. How soon are we talking about? Tomorrow afternoon. My attorney can meet with your legal team to finalize the partnership agreement, and I can have $7 million transferred to your accounts by close of business. Another pause. $7 million? I decided to go with the larger commitment. Jessica's right, we're not getting any younger, and this seems like the kind of opportunity that doesn't come along often. That's wonderful, Henry. I'll need to coordinate with my father and make sure our legal team is available on such short notice. Of course. But Derek? I want to be very clear about something. This investment represents nearly everything I have. If something were to go wrong with this project, if the returns don't materialize as promised, it would be financially devastating for Jessica and me. Henry, I understand your concerns, but I'm sure you do. And I'm sure you understand that a man who's about to lose everything he's worked for his entire life might be willing to take extreme measures to protect his family's future. The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone I'd used during our first phone call, but Derek Morrison was smart enough to understand the implications. Of course, he said. But that won't be necessary. This project is going to exceed your expectations in every way. I'm counting on it. The papers were signed the next afternoon in Patricia Hendricks' conference room. Charles Morrison, Derek, and Marcus Webb arrived with their attorney, a nervous-looking man who spent most of the meeting checking and rechecking documents, as if he couldn't believe what he was reading. And he probably couldn't. Because what Patricia had created was a masterpiece of legal misdirection. On the surface, it looked like a standard investment partnership agreement that gave the Morrison family access to $7 million for their Riverside Commons project. But buried in the fine print, disguised as routine clauses and standard protections, was a web of legal obligations that would give me ownership of everything they possessed the moment their project failed to meet its promised returns. The timeline for completion is 18 months, Patricia explained as we reviewed the key terms. With interim progress reports every 90 days. If the project fails to meet the benchmarked milestones outlined in Schedule C, the investment converts from a partnership stake to a secured loan with Morrison Development Group's assets serving as collateral. What kind of assets? Derek asked. All assets. Real estate holdings, business equipment, intellectual property, personal guarantees from the principal partners. Patricia's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing lunch plans. Standard protections for an investment of this magnitude. Charles Morrison's attorney whispered something urgent in his client's ear, but Charles waved him off. $7 million in immediate cash flow was apparently worth the risk of nebulous future complications. The wire transfer was completed at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. $7 million moved from my accounts to Morrison Development Group's operating fund, officially making me the largest private investor in the Riverside Commons project. It was also the beginning of the end for Derek Morrison and his family. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Patricia Hendricks had been coordinating with law enforcement agencies in 3 states, that Frank Castellano had been sharing his research with FBI financial crimes investigators, and that Thomas Patterson and Robert Chin had been documenting their own evidence of Morrison family crimes for years. The $7 million wasn't just an investment. It was bait in a trap that had been 18 months in the making, designed by people who understood exactly how predators like the Morrison family operated. And Derek Morrison had just walked into it with his eyes wide open and his hand extended for the money. The hardest part was over. Now all I had to do was wait for them to destroy themselves. 3 weeks after the investment was finalized, Derek Morrison made his first critical mistake. Jessica called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice shaking with something between rage and disbelief. "Dad, I need to show you something. Can you come over?" I found her in the lobby of her apartment building, holding a manila envelope and looking like she'd seen a ghost. "What is it?" "Derek's been lying about more than just the money stuff." She handed me the envelope. "I found these in his desk drawer." Inside were photographs. Dozens of them, taken with a telephoto lens from various distances and angles. Photos of Jessica jogging in the park. Photos of Jessica leaving work. Photos of Jessica meeting friends for coffee. Photos of Jessica that had been taken months before Derek had supposedly met her at that birthday party. But those weren't the worst ones. The worst ones were photos of me. Coming out of my house, getting into my truck, meeting with clients at job sites. Photos that had been taken over a period of at least a year, maybe longer. Photos that documented my daily routine with the precision of a surveillance operation. And at the bottom of the envelope, a typed report titled, Target Assessment, Henry Walsh. Jesus Christ. I breathed. There's more, Jessica said. Dad, I think Derek has been drugging me. The lobby seemed to tilt on its axis. What do you mean drugging you? I've been feeling weird for weeks. Tired all the time, dizzy, having trouble concentrating. I thought it was stress from the marriage problems, but look at this. She showed me a small vial she'd found hidden in Derek's toiletry kit. The label was in a language I didn't recognize, but the contents looked like some kind of liquid medication. I looked it up online. Jessica continued. It's a sedative. Something used to treat severe anxiety, but in larger doses it can cause memory problems, disorientation, make people more susceptible to suggestion. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Derek hadn't just been manipulating Jessica emotionally. He'd been chemically altering her mental state to make her more compliant, more trusting, less likely to question his behavior or notice the inconsistencies in his stories. How long has this been going on? I don't know. Maybe months. Maybe since we got married. Her voice cracked. Dad, I haven't been myself. I've been making decisions, agreeing to things, that don't make sense when I think about them now. What kind of decisions? Financial stuff, mostly. Derek would ask me questions about your business, about family finances, and I would tell him things I don't remember telling him. And there are gaps, Dad. Whole conversations I can't remember having. The rage that hit me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Derek Morrison hadn't just been planning to steal my money. He'd been systematically poisoning my daughter, altering her brain chemistry to turn her into an unwitting accomplice in his scheme. We need to get you to a hospital, I said. I already went. Had blood tests done yesterday. The doctor said there are traces of several different substances in my system, but they're metabolizing out now that I've stopped taking the vitamins Derek was giving me. The vitamins were drugged? Custom supplements, he said. For my health and energy. I've been taking them for months. I pulled out my phone and called Frank Castellano. Frank, we have a problem. Derek Morrison has been drugging Jessica, and we have evidence of extensive surveillance. How fast can you get to downtown? 20 minutes. What kind of evidence? Photos, medications, documentation. Enough to bury him if we handle this right. Don't touch anything else. Don't move anything. I'm calling some federal contacts who need to see this. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Frank arrived with 2 FBI agents who specialized in financial crimes and domestic abuse cases. They photographed everything, bagged the medications for analysis, and began the process of building a federal case against Derek Morrison and his family. But the federal investigation would take months to complete, and I wasn't willing to wait that long. Not when Derek was still free, still dangerous, and still legally married to my daughter. We need to accelerate our timeline, I told Frank privately while the FBI agents were processing evidence. What do you mean? I mean Derek's going to realize that Jessica found his surveillance materials. When he does, he'll either run or escalate. Either way, we're in immediate danger. So what do you want to do? I want to force his hand. Make him commit to a course of action before he realizes how much trouble he's in. That afternoon, I called Derek with what sounded like exciting news. Derek, I've been thinking about our investment, and I want to increase my commitment to the project. Increase it how? Another $3 million. I know it's more than we originally discussed, but I've been looking at the market projections, and I think we're being too conservative. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. Another $3 million? Derek said finally. I know it's short notice, but I want to get the funds transferred before the end of the month for tax purposes. Henry, that's a substantial additional investment. It's also a substantial opportunity. Unless you think the project can handle that level of funding? The challenge was deliberate. Derek Morrison's greed and his family's desperate financial situation would make it almost impossible for him to turn down $3 million additional, even if every instinct was telling him that something had changed. No, of course the project can handle it. I just want to make sure you've thought this through carefully. I have. But Derek, I'll need updated project documentation before I authorize the transfer. Financial statements, construction progress reports, that sort of thing. Financial statements? Due diligence, you understand? My attorney is being extra cautious given the size of the total investment. Of course. I'll get that information together, and we can meet early next week. Perfect. And Derek? Bring Jessica to the meeting. I'd like her to be involved in decisions of this magnitude. Another pause. That might not be necessary. I think it is. She's my daughter, and if something happens to me, she'll be inheriting the consequences of these investment decisions. I want her to understand what we're building here. Derek Morrison was now facing exactly the dilemma I'd intended to create. He needed the $3 million, but providing updated financial documentation would reveal that the Riverside Commons project was a complete fiction. And bringing Jessica to the meeting would put her in a position to ask questions that he couldn't answer without admitting to months of deception and criminal activity. But he was trapped by his own greed and his family's financial desperation. Turning down $3 million wasn't an option, which meant he would have to find a way to provide documentation for a project that didn't exist. That's when Derek Morrison made his second critical mistake. Instead of creating fake documentation, he decided to make the project real. Frank Castellano's surveillance over the next week revealed a frenzy of activity at Morrison Development Group offices. Phone calls to construction companies, meetings with city planning officials, frantic negotiations with property owners whose land was supposedly already under contract for the Riverside Commons development. They're actually trying to build the project, Frank told me over coffee. Charles Morrison is putting together a legitimate development deal to justify your investment. Can they do it? Not legally. The original contracts they showed you were fraudulent. They never actually had development rights for that property. Now they're trying to acquire those rights after the fact, using your $7 million as leverage. What happens if they succeed? If they can pull it off? You end up with a legitimate real estate investment that might actually make money. If they can't, they're looking at federal fraud charges, racketeering, and probably conspiracy to commit murder based on what we've uncovered about their previous victims. But I wasn't interested in a legitimate real estate investment. I was interested in justice for my daughter and for the families the Morrison clan had destroyed over the years. How do we make sure they can't pull it off? Frank smiled, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, it was the kind of smile that made me feel like we might actually win. We make sure the property owners know exactly who they're dealing with. The property that Charles Morrison was trying to acquire for the Riverside Commons development was owned by the Riverside Community Trust, a nonprofit organization that managed low-income housing and community services in that part of the city. The Trust's board of directors included several people who cared deeply about protecting vulnerable residents from predatory developers. People like Patricia Hendricks, who happened to serve as the Trust's legal counsel. People like Thomas Patterson, who'd been appointed to the board after losing his daughter and his fortune to the Morrison family. People like me, who'd been invited to join the board 3 months earlier as a representative of the construction industry. The Morrison family had spent weeks trying to negotiate development rights for property that was controlled by the very people they'd been victimizing. It was poetic justice on a level that even my father, with his love of ironic punishment, would have appreciated. The confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon in the Riverside Community Trust's conference room. Charles Morrison arrived with Derek, Marcus Webb, and 2 attorneys, prepared to make what they clearly believed would be a compelling offer for development rights. They found themselves facing a board of directors that included 3 of their previous victims, and a lawyer who'd spent months preparing for exactly this moment. "Gentlemen," Patricia said as they settled around the conference table, "before we begin discussing your development proposal, I think there are some disclosure issues we need to address." Charles Morrison's face went through several interesting color changes as Patricia methodically laid out the evidence of Morrison Development Group's history of defrauding investors, the suspicious deaths connected to their previous projects, and the federal investigation that was currently examining their business practices. Derek Morrison looked like he was going to vomit. Marcus Webb kept looking toward the door as if he was calculating his chances of making it to the elevator before security could stop him. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," Charles Morrison said when Patricia finished her presentation. "I don't think there has been," Thomas Patterson replied. "I think you gentlemen are exactly who we think you are. The question now is whether you'd like to discuss surrender terms or whether you'd prefer to wait for the FBI to make those decisions for you." And that's when Derek Morrison made his third and final mistake. Instead of accepting defeat gracefully, instead of trying to negotiate some kind of plea arrangement, instead of showing even a moment of remorse for what he'd done to Jessica and the other victims, Derek Morrison stood up and smiled. "You people have no idea what you're dealing with," he said. "This is bigger than just our family. Bigger than just these investments. And if you think you can threaten us and walk away, you're about to learn exactly how wrong you are." It was a threat. Clear, direct, and witnessed by 8 people in a room equipped with recording devices. It was also the last mistake Derek Morrison would ever make as a free man. The FBI arrested Derek Morrison at 6:23 a.m. the following morning. I know the exact time because Frank Castellano called me as it was happening, his voice tight with satisfaction and something that sounded like relief. "They got him at his gym," Frank said. "Apparently, he was trying to maintain his normal routine, probably thought he could brazen it out." "What about Charles Morrison and the others?" "Simultaneous arrests. The whole family, plus Marcus Webb and 3 other associates. Federal marshals are executing search warrants on their homes, offices, and bank accounts as we speak." I was standing in my kitchen, watching the sunrise through the window and trying to process the fact that the nightmare was finally over. After months of investigation, planning, and careful maneuvering, the Morrison family's criminal empire was collapsing in real time. "What are the charges?" "Wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the deaths of Lisa Patterson and David Chin. And that's just the federal charges. State prosecutors in 3 jurisdictions are preparing their own cases. The conspiracy to commit murder charges were the ones that would keep Derek Morrison behind bars for the rest of his life. Frank's investigation had uncovered evidence that the Morrison family had been systematically eliminating witnesses who could testify about their fraudulent schemes. Lisa Patterson's car accident had been caused by sabotage. David Chen's apparent suicide had involved forged documents and fabricated evidence. "What about Jessica? Is she safe?" "She's with protective custody teams right now. The FBI found evidence that Derek was planning to eliminate her as soon as he gained access to your full inheritance. There were travel arrangements, life insurance policies, and what looked like a planned accident scenario similar to what happened to the other victims' children." My legs went weak, and I had to sit down at the kitchen table. The scope of Derek Morrison's evil was still revealing itself, and each new detail was more horrifying than the last. He was going to kill her. The working theory is that he was going to stage her death after convincing you to invest the remainder of your inheritance in Morrison Development Group projects. Make it look like an accident or suicide brought on by financial stress, leaving him as your grieving son-in-law and the natural inheritor of whatever assets remained. I thought about Jessica's weight loss, her nervousness, the way she'd asked if she was making a mistake on the night before her wedding. Some part of her had sensed the danger, even while being chemically manipulated to ignore her instincts. "Where is she now?" "Safe house downtown. She wants to see you, but the FBI needs to debrief her first. There are still some details about Derek's operation that only she can provide." The debriefing took most of the day. Jessica spent 6 hours with federal agents, going through months of marriage to Derek Morrison and identifying moments when she'd been drugged, manipulated, or coerced into providing information about our family's finances. The picture that emerged was of a systematic campaign of psychological and chemical abuse designed to turn my daughter into an unwitting accomplice in her own father's destruction. Derek had been slowly increasing the dosages of sedatives in her vitamins while simultaneously gathering intelligence about my business operations, my personal routines, and my potential vulnerabilities. He'd also been documenting everything, apparently as insurance against his family's organization and as proof of his value to their criminal enterprise. The FBI had recovered hundreds of hours of recordings, thousands of photographs, and detailed written reports about both Jessica and me. The irony, Agent Sarah Collins told me during my own debriefing session, is that Morrison was so thorough in documenting his crimes that he created the evidence we needed to prosecute his entire family. What's the timeline for trial? Federal prosecutors are confident they can get convictions on the racketeering and murder conspiracy charges within 18 months. The state cases will probably take longer, but Derek Morrison is looking at multiple life sentences regardless. And Charles Morrison? Same charges, same potential sentences. This was a family business, and everyone involved is going down together. When I was finally allowed to see Jessica that evening, I found her in a conference room at the FBI field office, looking exhausted but more alert than she'd seemed in months. "Dad," she said, standing up to hug me. "I'm so sorry." "For what?" "For not seeing it. For not trusting my instincts. For putting both of us in danger because I was too naive to recognize what Derek really was. Jessica, you were being chemically manipulated. This wasn't your fault. But I should have known something was wrong. I should have asked more questions, should have paid attention to the warning signs." We sat down across from each other, and I could see that she was struggling with guilt that would probably take years to fully process. "The warning signs were there," I said. "But they were subtle, and you were dealing with someone who'd spent his entire life learning how to manipulate people. Derek Morrison was a professional predator with resources and training that most people never encounter." "How long did you know?" "I suspected something was wrong from the beginning. Started investigating about 6 weeks after the wedding." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, and I didn't want to destroy your marriage if I was wrong. And because once I realized how dangerous Derek was, I was afraid that confronting him directly would put you in immediate physical danger." Jessica was quiet for a long moment. "Dad, Agent Collins told me about the inheritance. About the $9 million. Here it was. The conversation I'd been dreading since the letter from my father's attorney had arrived 11 months earlier. "I should have told you about the money from the beginning." "Yes, you should have. But I understand why you didn't." "Do you?" "You were protecting me. Maybe not in the right way, but for the right reasons. And if you told me about the inheritance, I probably would have mentioned it to Derek at some point. Which means he would have known exactly how much money was at stake. And he might have moved faster, been more aggressive. Or killed both of us before you had time to figure out what he was planning." We talked for another hour, working through months of deception, manipulation, and fear. Jessica was angry about the secrets I'd kept, but she was also grateful that those secrets had ultimately saved both our lives. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we rebuild. You get counseling to deal with the psychological trauma. We work with the FBI to make sure Derek's prosecution goes smoothly, and we figure out how to move forward with our lives." "And the money? What about it?" "Dad, you have $9 million. That changes things." "Does it?" "It should. You could travel, buy a bigger house, retire completely. You could do anything you want." I looked at my daughter, still recovering from months of abuse but already thinking about my happiness and my future, and realized that I had been overthinking the inheritance question from the beginning. "What I want," I said, "is for you to be safe and happy. Everything else is just details." The trials began 8 months later. Derek Morrison was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Charles Morrison received the same sentence. Marcus Webb and the other associates received terms ranging from 15 to 30 years. The civil lawsuits began immediately after the criminal trials concluded. The Morrison family had assets worth approximately $43 million, most of it accumulated through decades of financial fraud. Those assets were distributed among their victims, with Jessica receiving the largest settlement due to the severity of the abuse she'd suffered. Thomas Patterson got his daughter's life insurance money back, plus damages. Robert Chen recovered most of his $8 million loss, plus additional compensation for his son's wrongful death. 6 other families received settlements that provided some measure of financial justice for what they'd lost. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that Derek Morrison and his family would never hurt anyone else, would never target another family, would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison cells thinking about the greed and cruelty that had brought them down. The inheritance that had started this whole nightmare ended up being irrelevant to the outcome. Derek Morrison would have targeted Jessica regardless of how much money I had, because his family's business model was built on identifying and exploiting vulnerable wealthy targets through their children. The money I'd kept secret had given me options, had allowed me to hire Frank Castellano and Patricia Hendricks, had provided the resources necessary to build a trap sophisticated enough to catch professional criminals. But it was Jessica's courage in recognizing that something was wrong, and her decision to trust me with what she'd discovered, that had really saved us. 2 years after Derek Morrison's arrest, I got a call from Agent Sarah Collins that I'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. "Henry, I wanted to let you know that we just closed the final case connected to the Morrison investigation." "Final case?" "We found evidence linking Charles Morrison to 6 additional murders over the past 20 years. All of them were either investors who'd started asking uncomfortable questions or family members who'd become liabilities to their ongoing operations." I was in my study when she called, the same room where I'd first learned about my father's inheritance. Outside the window, I could see Jessica playing with her 8-month-old daughter in the backyard, both of them laughing at something only they found funny. 6 more murders? At least 6. There might be others that we can't definitively connect to their organization. But Henry, this is important. Every one of those victims had family members who are still alive, who never got answers about what really happened to their loved ones. Your decision to fight back instead of becoming another victim saved their families from decades of uncertainty. After Agent Collins hung up, I sat in my study for a long time, thinking about paths taken and not taken, about the weight of secrets, and the price of truth. The $9 million that had started this whole ordeal was still sitting in investment accounts, growing steadily through careful management and conservative strategies. I'd used less than $2 million of it for the investigation, legal fees, and security measures during the most dangerous period of Derek's prosecution. Jessica had refused to accept any of the inheritance money, insisting that it belonged to me and that she wanted to build her own life on her own terms. The settlement from the Morrison family assets had provided her with enough financial security to start fresh, and she'd used it to buy a house in a safe neighborhood and establish a college fund for her daughter. My granddaughter, Emma Sarah Walsh, named for both Jessica's mother and the new beginning she represented, would never know how close she'd come to never existing. Derek Morrison's plan had included Jessica's death before any children could be born, eliminating potential heirs who might complicate his access to the inheritance. But Emma was here, healthy and happy and completely unaware that her grandfather had once gone to war with criminals to protect her future. Sometimes I watched her playing in the backyard and wondered what kind of world she would grow up in, what kind of challenges she would face, whether she would ever need the kind of protection I'd provided for her mother. The construction business had thrived in the aftermath of the Morrison investigation. Word had gotten around that I was the man who'd taken down a major financial crime family, and that reputation had attracted clients who valued discretion, competence, and the kind of moral backbone that was apparently rarer in the business world than it should be. I'd used some of the inheritance money to expand the company, hiring additional crews and taking on larger projects. But I'd also established a foundation that provided financial assistance to families who'd been victimized by investment fraud and other white-collar crimes. Thomas Patterson had become the foundation's first board member. Robert Chen had joined 6 months later. Together, we'd created a support network for people who'd lost everything to predators like the Morrison family, providing both financial assistance and the kind of investigative resources that most victims couldn't afford on their own. You know what the strangest part is? Thomas told me during one of our quarterly board meetings. I spent 15 years wanting revenge against the people who killed my daughter. Now that they're in prison for life, I don't feel what I expected to feel. What do you feel? Empty, I guess. Like I built my whole life around hating them, and now that they're gone, I have to figure out what comes next. I understood what he meant. The months of investigation, planning, and legal warfare had given me a sense of purpose that was hard to replace once the immediate danger was over. There's something addictive about fighting for your family's survival, about knowing that every decision could mean the difference between life and death. But there was also something liberating about returning to ordinary concerns. Worrying about construction schedules and weather delays and whether Jessica was getting enough sleep with the new baby felt wonderfully mundane after worrying about assassination plots and federal investigations. What comes next, I told Thomas, is whatever you choose to build with the time you have left. The foundation had helped 18 families recover from investment fraud in its first 2 years of operation. Not all of the cases involved violence or murder threats, but all of them involved people who trusted the wrong person with their life savings and found themselves financially devastated as a result. Some of the victims were elderly couples who'd been targeted by financial advisors selling fraudulent retirement investments. Some were small business owners who'd been convinced to invest in development projects that existed only on paper. Some were young families who'd been manipulated through social media scams that promised easy wealth and delivered financial ruin. Each case reminded me how easily it could have been Jessica and me on the other side of that equation, if I hadn't kept the inheritance secret, if I hadn't hired Frank Castellano, if I hadn't been suspicious enough of Derek Morrison's motives to investigate his background. Luck had played a role in our survival, but so had preparation and the willingness to fight back when fighting back seemed impossible. The most satisfying case the Foundation handled involved a family in Oregon whose adult son had married a woman who'd systematically drained their retirement accounts through elaborate sob stories and fake investment opportunities. The woman had disappeared with $340,000, leaving behind forged documents and a trail of lies that seemed impossible to follow. But Frank Castellano, now working as the Foundation's chief investigator, had tracked her to a luxury resort in Costa Rica, where she was living under a false identity and planning her next con. Working with international law enforcement, we'd managed to recover most of the stolen money and ensure that the woman faced prosecution for her crimes. It's not about the money, the victim's father told me when we delivered the recovered funds. It's about knowing that she can't do this to another family. It's about justice. Justice. The word that had driven me through the darkest months of the Morrison investigation, the concept that had sustained me when the smart move would have been to take Jessica and disappear somewhere Derek Morrison could never find us. But justice, I'd learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoration, about making sure that victims could rebuild their lives and that predators couldn't continue victimizing others. Derek Morrison would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison cell, but the families he'd destroyed were healing. Some had recovered financially through the asset seizures and civil settlements. All of them had recovered psychologically through the knowledge that their loved ones' deaths had been avenged, and that the people responsible would never hurt anyone else. That was worth more than $9 million. It was worth more than any amount of money. But the money had made it possible. 3 years after Derek Morrison's conviction, Jessica remarried. Her new husband, Michael Brennan, was a pediatric nurse who'd met Jessica at Emma's doctor's office during a routine checkup. He was kind, gentle, and completely uninterested in Jessica's financial situation or her connection to the Morrison case. The background check I'd run on Michael, without Jessica's knowledge, because some habits die hard, revealed a man who dedicated his career to caring for sick children, who volunteered at homeless shelters in his spare time, and who'd never been married because he'd been too busy taking care of his disabled mother until her death 2 years earlier. "Dad," Jessica said when she introduced us, "I want you to meet Michael. But I need you to promise me something." "What's that?" "Promise me you won't investigate him the way you investigated Derek." Jessica. I'm serious. I know you mean well, but I need to be able to trust my own judgment. I need to know that I can recognize good people and bad people without my father hiring private investigators to tell me the difference. It was a fair request, and a sign of how much Jessica had healed from the trauma of her marriage to Derek Morrison. She was stronger now, more confident in her instincts, better able to protect herself and her daughter from people who might wish them harm. I promise, I said. And I kept that promise, even when every protective instinct was screaming at me to make sure Michael Brennan was exactly who he appeared to be. Because Jessica was right. She needed to trust her own judgment, and I needed to trust that I'd raised a daughter who was smart enough and strong enough to make good choices for herself and her family. The wedding was small, held in Jessica's backyard on a sunny Saturday afternoon in May. Emma, now 2 years old and walking with the determined waddle of a toddler, served as flower girl, scattering petals with enthusiastic randomness while the 20 guests laughed and applauded. Michael's vows were simple and heartfelt, promising to love Jessica and Emma, to protect them, and to build a life together based on honesty, respect, and mutual support. Jessica's vows were equally straightforward, but I heard the echo of hard-won wisdom in her words about trust, communication, and the importance of being with someone who wanted to build something real rather than take something away. I walked Jessica down the aisle for the second time in 4 years, but this time felt completely different. There was no nervous tension, no underlying dread, no sense that we were all participating in a performance designed to hide darker truths. This time, my daughter was marrying someone who loved her for who she was, not for what she could provide access to. This time, I was confident that I was giving my daughter to someone who would cherish and protect her rather than exploit and endanger her. This time, the happiness was real. 5 years have passed since Derek Morrison was sentenced to life in prison. I'm 71 years old now, officially retired from construction but still serving on the foundation board and still occasionally consulting on projects that interest me. Jessica, Michael, and Emma lived 10 minutes away in a house that Michael and I built together during the first year of their marriage. It was the first construction project I'd worked on purely for joy rather than profit, and every nail we drove felt like a small victory over the forces that had tried to destroy our family. Emma is 7 now, a bright, curious child who loves books and soccer and asking questions that would challenge graduate students in philosophy. She calls me Grandpa Henry and has no idea that her existence was once threatened by people who saw her potential birth as an obstacle to their criminal schemes. Michael turned out to be exactly who he appeared to be, a good man who loves his family and works hard to make the world a little better for the children in his care. The background check I'd promised not to run would have revealed nothing more interesting than overdue library books and a perfect attendance record at work. But here's the thing that still amazes me: Jessica never needed my investigation or my protection to recognize Michael's worth. Her judgment, sharpened by the experience of surviving Derek Morrison's deceptions, had led her to someone who represented everything Derek had pretended to be. She'd learned to trust her instincts again, and those instincts were better than any private investigator I could have hired. The $9 million inheritance sits in carefully managed investment accounts, growing steadily and funding the foundation's work. I've never touched the principal for personal expenses, living instead on the returns from my construction business and the satisfaction of knowing that my father's money is being used to protect other families from the kind of predators who targeted us. It's ironic in a way. My father spent his life accumulating wealth through ruthless business practices and treating his family like disappointing investments. After his death, his money became the tool that saved his granddaughter from people who were even more ruthless than he'd ever been. Maybe that was justice too. Maybe the universe has a sense of humor after all. Last month, I received a letter from Derek Morrison. It was forwarded through the federal prison system, screened by security, and delivered by Agent Collins, who wanted to make sure I was prepared for whatever psychological manipulation Derek might be attempting. The letter was brief. Henry, I know you'll probably never forgive me for what I did to Jessica and what I plan to do to both of you. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I'm writing because I want you to know that I understand now what I destroyed. I've had 5 years in prison to think about Jessica's kindness, her intelligence, her capacity for love. I've had 5 years to realize that I threw away something real and irreplaceable for money that wouldn't have made me happy anyway. I know this doesn't change anything. I know I deserve to spend the rest of my life in prison for what I did. But I wanted you to know that Jessica deserved better than me, and I'm glad she found it. Take care of her. Take care of Emma. They're lucky to have you. Derek. I read the letter 3 times, looking for hidden meanings or subtle threats or some kind of manipulation that I might have missed. But it seemed like what it claimed to be, an acknowledgement of guilt from a man who'd finally understood the magnitude of what he'd lost through his own choices. I showed the letter to Jessica, who read it once and then handed it back to me without comment. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think Derek Morrison spent his whole life lying to people," she said. "I don't see any reason to assume he's started telling the truth now." "So you think it's fake? Another manipulation?" "I think it doesn't matter. Real or fake, sincere or calculated, it doesn't change what happened or what he deserves." Jessica was right, as she usually was about important things. Derek Morrison's letter was irrelevant to our lives, whether it represented genuine remorse or just another attempt to manipulate the people he'd harmed. What mattered was that we'd survived his predation, that we'd built something stronger from the wreckage he'd created, and that Emma would grow up in a world where her family was united, honest, and committed to protecting each other. I burned Derek's letter in my fireplace that evening, watching the pages turn to ash and thinking about the difference between destruction and reconstruction. Derek Morrison had been an agent of destruction, taking apart families, relationships, and lives for his own profit. The investigation that brought him down had required its own kind of destruction, tearing apart his lies and exposing the truth beneath them. But everything that came after had been about building something better. The foundation built financial security for fraud victims. Jessica and Michael built a marriage based on genuine love and mutual respect. Emma was building her understanding of the world through curiosity, kindness, and the confidence that came from being surrounded by people who would protect her without asking for anything in return. I'd built a different relationship with wealth, one where money was a tool for helping others rather than a measure of personal worth. And all of us together had built a family that was stronger, more honest, and more resilient than what we'd had before Derek Morrison had tried to destroy it. That was the real victory. Not Derek's conviction or the Morrison family's financial ruin, but the life we'd created in the aftermath of their attempt to take everything from us. If you've followed this story to the end, if you've stayed with me through months of investigation and years of consequences, then you understand something important about revenge and justice, and the price of keeping secrets. Revenge is about destroying your enemies. Justice is about protecting your family. And sometimes, if you're smart enough and strong enough and lucky enough, you can accomplish both at the same time. The secret I kept about my father's inheritance was meant to protect Jessica from changes that I thought might be harmful. In the end, that secret became the weapon I used to protect her from dangers I never could have imagined. But the most important lesson I learned wasn't about money or investigations or criminal prosecutions. It was about the difference between being a victim and being a survivor. Victims let things happen to them. Survivors fight back. Derek Morrison and his family spent their careers creating victims, people who trusted the wrong person, made the wrong investment, believed the wrong promises. They succeeded because most people, when faced with sophisticated deception and overwhelming force, choose to accept their losses rather than risk losing even more. I chose to fight back. Jessica chose to fight back. And together, we turned what should have been Derek Morrison's greatest victory into his complete and final defeat. That choice, the choice to fight rather than surrender, to seek justice rather than accept injustice, to protect family rather than protect wealth, that choice made all the difference. If you're facing your own Derek Morrison, if someone in your life is trying to manipulate, exploit, or harm you or the people you love, remember this: they win only if you let them win. They succeed only if you choose to be a victim rather than a survivor. Don't let them win. Fight back. And if you found this story helpful, if it gave you insight into the tactics predators use or the resources available to fight them, then share it with someone who might need to hear it. Hit that subscribe button and share this video, because somewhere out there is another family facing what we faced, and they deserve to know that fighting back is possible. They deserve to know that justice is possible. They deserve to know that love and truth and stubborn determination can triumph over greed and lies and violence. Thank you for listening to my story. Take care of your families. Trust your instincts. And never, ever let the predators win.